In the early hours of June 28, 1969, a routine police raid at a New York City bar sparked a rebellion that would forever change the fight for LGBTQ rights. But the Stonewall Uprising was not a simple case of police brutality against peaceful patrons. The Stonewall Inn, located in Greenwich Village, was a dingy, mafia-run establishment. It had no running water behind the bar, no fire exits, and the liquor was often homemade and untaxed. The bar was owned by the Genovese crime family, who saw it as a cash cow. They charged high prices for weak drinks and routinely extorted wealthy patrons to keep them quiet about their sexual orientation. Despite the seedy conditions, the Stonewall Inn was one of the few places where gay people, especially those who were poor or transgender, could dance and socialize without fear of being arrested for simply being who they were. New York's liquor laws in the 1960s made it illegal for bars to serve alcohol to known homosexuals. The state liquor authority used this to revoke licenses of any bar that welcomed a gay clientele. The Stonewall Inn operated without a liquor license, relying on payoffs to local police to stay open. The mafia owners paid off the 6th Precinct to turn a blind eye to the illegal activities inside. But in 1969, the political winds were shifting. A new mayor, John Lindsay, was trying to clean up the police department and break the ties between cops and organized crime. The state liquor authority had been cracking down on unlicensed bars, and the Stonewall Inn was a prime target. The owners knew the raid was coming, and they were prepared to pay off the officers as they had done many times before. On the night of June 28th, a team of plainclothes and uniformed police officers entered the bar, announced a raid, and began rounding up patrons. They were looking for illegal alcohol, not just people violating the state's anti-gay laws. The raid was not a random act of violence. It was a routine vice operation targeting the bar's unlicensed liquor. The police expected to make a few arrests, confiscate the alcohol, and be done. But something was different that night. The patrons were not the usual middle-class crowd. The Stonewall had become a haven for the most marginalized, homeless queer youth, drag queens, and street kids who had nowhere else to go. These were people who had already lost everything. They had been kicked out of their homes, fired from their jobs, and harassed by police their entire lives. When the raid happened, they had no reason to be afraid of the consequences. As the police began loading patrons into a paddy wagon, a crowd gathered outside. They were not there to watch, they were there to resist. The first to push back were the drag queens and the street kids. Accounts say that a lesbian was being forcibly taken to the wagon when she fought back and shouted to the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" That moment galvanized the onlookers. The crowd began to throw coins, then bottles and bricks. The police, caught off guard, retreated inside the bar and barricaded themselves. They were outnumbered and unprepared for this level of defiance. The uprising continued for the next several nights. Hundreds of people, many of them LGBTQ, clashed with police in the streets of Greenwich Village. The Stonewall Inn itself was set on fire and damaged. The police eventually regained control of the streets, but the damage was done. The Stonewall Uprising was not the first time LGBTQ people had fought back, but it was the first to spark a sustained national movement. In the months after the uprising, activist groups formed, like the Gay Liberation Front, which organized public protests and demanded an end to anti-gay laws. The first gay pride marches were held on the one-year anniversary of Stonewall in June 1970 in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. These marches were a direct legacy of the spontaneous uprising at the bar. The story of Stonewall is often simplified to a moment of brave resistance against an unjust police raid. But the reality is more complex. The uprising was triggered by the mafia's greed and the state's aggressive efforts to enforce anti-gay liquor laws. The people who fought back were not the organized, middle-class gay rights activists of the time. They were the overlooked members of the community the homeless, the gender nonconforming, the performers who had nothing to lose. Their resistance transformed a routine vice raid into a turning point in human rights history. The Stonewall Uprising reminds us that change often comes from those most oppressed, and that the fight for equality is never won by a single act, but by the courage of those who refuse to comply. Subscribe for more stories like this.